Welcome to the Ernie Chambers Show.
Friends, enemies, neutrals, and I threw in the word fools because we have some of those, and I want everybody to know that they're welcome to sit in on this little presentation. We cannot judge people at one instant in time and consider that to be entirely what the person is. Wise people do foolish things. Foolish people often say wise things. So the best course to follow when we're dealing with human beings is to allow a period of time to elapse which is sufficiently long to give us an index into what that person may really be. Maybe somebody had, like Scrooge had said, an undigested bit of mustard that caused somebody to have a nightmare. It could have caused somebody to have an upset stomach, which upset everything else. So that is out of the way, and I can begin to talk about what is happening in the Middle East. It's extremely troubling to me because I see parallels to every instance in history when one group which had virtual total domination over another group, all types of injustices and even cruelties come into play. There seems to be, unless we're very careful, an underlying streak of that prehistoric, pre-civilized barbarity that causes us to feel sometimes a sense of pleasure in inflicting pain on others who have not harmed us, others who are unforgiving in what they do, but they haven't done anything to us. So we have to allow enough time for the thing to unfold. More than enough time has unfolded to allow the so-called Jewish state, and that's the way those in Israel often describe their state, enough time to show that they are humane, that they believe in justice. They will do unto others as they would be done by, and under all circumstances would never engage in the kind of conduct which created a very dark, ominous period in Jewish history known as the Holocaust. Some people learn from bad things that happen, how hurtful they are, and will avoid doing those things. Others incorporate all of the worst aspects of that situation and become practitioners of the very kind of thing that was done to them. And that's what Israel, which I refer to often as Nazi Israel, is doing to the Palestinians. These people who call themselves Jews, who call themselves Zionists, are not the original inhabitants of Palestine. They came from Europe. There were people living in Palestine. They were known as the Palestinians. They were displaced by the people who call themselves Jews or Zionists who were fleeing Europe to get away from what they call anti-Semitism. Then, instead of being examples of how virtue can spring up in a person who himself or herself has been abused, they duplicate and sometimes outdo the horrors that were inflicted on them by the Nazis. Right now, there are demonstrations on campuses all over this country, even out east where they have the elite universities, those whose names might be familiar to you, Columbia, Brown. Even down in Texas, they have this kind of student demonstration activity going on. In the eastern areas, the students are erecting tent, you can say villages, where they will occupy space and make their protest. They allow their bodies to become a magnification or amplification of what is in their mind. They are willing to be arrested, not eager to be arrested, not desiring to be arrested, but willing to face arrest. The brutality that often is inflicted by American so-called law enforcement persons, some of whom have a streak of sadism, which manifests itself whenever they are dealing with helpless, weak, or disadvantaged people. So they are now sending these kinds of people, not everyone in a police uniform fits the description I've given, but enough of them do to cause people to make a generalization about all people who are attired in such a manner. Clubs have been used on these students, tear gas, tasers. They have been wrestled to the ground, some thrown to the ground in what is supposed to be a civilized country. And the irony is that they call themselves enforcing the law against those they consider lawbreakers. Lawbreakers because they have become, based on what the university magnates say, trespassers, destroyers of property. So they call in the goon squad. I have an article that appeared March 30th. Every article that I read from will be found in the Omaha World Herald. The headline, "Campuses Take Action to Put End to Protests." So that virus, which originated in Israel, has led to an infectious disease on the shores of what some people call the greatest country on the face of the earth, but I dissent from that opinion. Campuses take action to put in to protests. New York. Colleges around the U.S. implored pro-Palestinian student protesters to clear out tent encampments with rising levels of urgency Monday, with more arrests being made at the University of Texas and an ultimatum from Columbia University for students to sign a form and leave the encampment or face suspension. Excuse me. Protesters who returned to the University of Texas, Austin, on Monday were met by dozens of law enforcement officers, many in riot gears. 6 protesters were quickly arrested and others were taken into custody one by one. Officers used pepper spray on a group of protesters who blocked the path of a police van carrying demonstrators who were arrested. The crowd backed away, but continued to block the exit from campus. Officers then used 2 flashbang explosives to clear a path. Republican Governor Greg Abbott reposted video on social media of troopers arriving on the 50,000 student campus that's in Texas. Quote, "No encampments will be allowed. Instead, arrests are being made," Abbott posted. Just last week, hundreds of police, including some on horseback and wielding batons, long clubs, pushed into protesters at the university, sending some tumbling into the street. Officers made 34 arrests at the behest of the university and Abbott, according to the State Department of Public Safety's statement. In New York, Columbia activists defied the 2 p.m. deadline to respond to the ultimatum with chants, clapping, and drumming from the encampment of more than 300 people. Here's something that these university people should keep in mind while all this is going on. In the classroom, students are encouraged to develop a system of values and beliefs, and along with that, a willingness to stand up for those beliefs and even place themselves at risk by so doing. And now they're putting into practice out in the world what they learned in the classroom. But the ones who teach in the classroom never expect the time of the boomerang, where they throw something out, it goes out, and then it comes back to the point of origin. No officials at Columbia appeared to enter the encampment with at least 120 tents staying up as the deadline passed. Hundreds of protesters marched around the quad, weaving around piles of temporary flooring and green carpet meant for, of all things, graduation ceremonies. Here was a type of graduation going on right now, a graduation from the theoretical classroom into the postgraduate realm of the real world. A handful of counter-demonstrators waved Israeli flags, and one held a sign reading, quote, "Where are the anti-Hamas chants," unquote. You notice they don't attack the ones who are speaking for Israel. They attack those who are sympathetic toward the Palestinians. So even as the law enforcers come to enforce the law, there's a type of discrimination, you could even call it racism, involved in how they apply the power that they were given by the state. The notice sent by the Ivy League University in Manhattan said if protesters left by the deadline and signed a form committing to abide by university policies through June 2025, or an earlier graduation, they could finish the semester in good standing. If not, the letter said, they would be suspended pending further investigation. Early protests at Columbia, where demonstrators set up tents in the center of the campus, inspired pro-Palestinian demonstrations across the country. Students and others have been sparring over the Israeli-Hamas war and its mounting death toll. Many students are demanding their universities cut financial ties with Israel. This is known as divestment. Like I got the legislature to pass legislation requiring the divestment of state funds or the withdrawal of state funds from all companies doing business in or with South Africa. That action was copied by states around the country, and it led ultimately to the fall of the worst racial discrimination on the planet of the earth at that time, apartheid, in South Africa. These students are viewing what Israel is doing in much the same way that people viewed South Africa's abuse of black people, whose country it was. These Boers, or white people, came from Holland and other parts of Europe and dominated that area because they brought kill power with them. It's interesting that in all the countries where white Europeans came and attacked and used violence, they referred to the inhabitants as savages, yet they had not developed any kill instruments like the white Christians brought. They had lived in peace among and between themselves, but that would be another dissertation on another time, at another time. The number of arrests at campuses nationwide is approaching 1,000. The protests even spread to Europe, with French police removing dozens of students from the Sorbonne University after anti-war protesters occupied the main courtyard. College classes are wrapping up for the semester, and campuses are preparing for graduation ceremonies. This is giving schools an extra incentive to clear the encampments. By all means, no matter what practical lessons are being acted upon and demonstrated, the very important ceremony of graduation must take priority and precedence over everything else. Students dug in their heels at some high-profile universities, with standoffs also continuing at Harvard, the University of Pennsylvania, Yale, and others. Protesters at Yale set up a new camp with dozens of tents Sunday, almost a week after police arrested nearly 50 and cleared a similar camp nearby. They were notified by the Yale officials that they could face discipline, including suspension and possible arrest if they continued. Yale said in a statement Monday it does not tolerate policy violations such as the encampment. School officials said the protest is near residential colleges where many students are studying for final exams, and that permission must be granted for groups to hold events and put up structures on campus. Fair enough. To be forewarned is to be forearmed. But there come times when people feel that a more important issue is at stake than following the rules laid down by a university. Quote, from the Yale officials, "We urge you to remove the encampment so that we do not deprive your fellow students, their families, and friends of this momentous occasion." The word momentous is not usually applied to a graduation. The demonstrations have led Columbia to hold remote classes. The school said in an email to students that bringing back police, quote, "at this time," unquote, would be counterproductive. The university said it will offer an alternative venue for the protests after exams and graduation. Columbia's handling of the protests has prompted federal complaints. A class action lawsuit on behalf of Jewish students alleges a breach of contract by Columbia, claiming the university failed to maintain a safe learning environment despite policies and promises. It also challenges the move away from in-person classes and seeks quick court action requiring Columbia to provide security for the students. Meanwhile, a legal group representing pro-Palestinian students urged the U.S. Department of Education Civil Rights Office to investigate Columbia compliance with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 for how they have been treated. A university spokesperson declined comment on the complaints. The plight of students who have been arrested has become a central part of protests, with the students and a growing number of faculty demanding amnesty for protesters. At issue is whether the suspensions and legal records will follow students through their adult lives. A lot of times, things are not well thought out, and policies are put in place in an environment where they really need not be there, but they're anticipatory, expecting or projecting that there may be a use for such procedures and processes. They would put them in place so that anybody who was affected by them would have had prior notice. A law should always give a person who is going to be subject to it a clear understanding of what is allowed and what is prohibited. If the law is unclear and a person, say, is arrested and charged with a crime, there have been times when the charge was thrown out and the law deemed unconstitutional because it did not clearly state the conduct that was being prohibited and which would cause the punishments. While I was in the legislature, I had to rewrite many pieces of legislation based on this very principle, that the state has all of this power, but before it can use it in a punitive manner, It has to inform the citizen of what conduct will result in the application of state force. So although I was known for what they called filibustering, I called it extended discussion and debate. I helped rewrite the bills of people who brought them because some group like the nutty National Rifle Association or some other nitwit operation would tell them, this has been enacted in another state, so do it here. Since I've been out of the legislature, there are two animals whose characteristics can be used to define the way the legislature operates. Cat and monkey. Copycat, monkey see, monkey do. They come into the legislature not knowing anything. Some organization or a lobbyist will stroke their ego by saying, I want you to bring this bill. And the person, without understanding it, many times without having read it, will offer it. And when I was there, they would get a lesson and their hat brought to them. Eventually, they came to the conclusion and awareness that I knew what I was talking about, and that if they wanted somebody to give them the straight scoop, I was that person. Even if it was somebody I did not personally care for. My job was not to be a friend or to make friends. It was to make good law. When somebody brought a proposal that might wind up being law, I felt a personal obligation, if nobody else did, to see that the citizens out there who are going to be affected by that law would be given a clear picture, understanding, explanation of what they are prohibited from doing. So they copycat bad legislation. They monkey see, monkey do. If such and such a state did it, then Nebraska should too. My job was hard. I earned that $12,000 a year. Actually more than that, but I knew what the job paid when I took it. But when I took it, the pay was $4,800 a year. When I knew in advance, excuse me, what the rules were, then I should be prepared to play by the rules or use the system established by the rules to change the rules. So the first thing I did was master the rule book. Some people describe it broadly as parliamentary procedure, and there was no bill that I couldn't find something wrong with or a way to delay it. Let me go into something else now. This article is dated 10/25/23. I'm going to leave it to you to determine which is the 10th month. Okay? Israeli strikes kill hundreds in Gaza strips. Remember, the Israelis are the ones with the bombs, the missiles, the tanks, the machine guns, and they're supplied by the United States of America against people who are unarmed. This should not be called a war. It's a massacre. But when the ones who do the defining come to define something that means something to them, they give it a sweet-smelling, sweet-sounding name, or one that is acceptable. So a war suggests the idea of two combatants, each one in a position to fight against the other. But when you have planes, tanks, bombs, missiles, machine guns, and I have sticks and stones and bricks, that's not a war. That is a massacre. And if the same thing were being done to the Israelis, that's what it would be called, if the ones doing it were the Palestinians, who occupied the land now called Israel, and where they are held prisoners and kept in a subhuman status by their conquerors with the help of the United States and the UK. Rafah, Gaza Strip. Israel escalated airstrikes across the Gaza Strip on Tuesday, crushing families and the rubble of residential buildings. As health officials said, hundreds of Palestinians were killed and medical facilities were shut down because of bomb damage and a lack of power. These Jews bombing hospitals. Then they don't want you to use the term Jews when you describe them. They self-describe themselves as Jews. They self-describe their country, and I put there in quotation marks because it's stolen land, as the Jewish state. The soaring death toll from Israel's bombardment is unprecedented in the decades-long Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It augurs an even greater loss of life in Gaza once Israeli forces backed by tanks and artillery launch an expected ground offensive aimed at crushing Hamas militants. They're not crushing Hamas militants, they're killing women and children. The vast majority of people killed during this activity comprises women and children. Oh yes, the Jewish state is bold and brave when they can bring tanks, artillery, bombs, and whatnot against women and children, all of whom are unarmed, unresisting. Gaza's 2.3 million people have been running out of food, water, and medicine since Israel sealed off the territory after the devastating October 7th attack by Hamas on towns in southern Israel. Oh, Hamas was wrong, no doubt about it. There's no question about it. But the response has to be proportional to the provocation. The Gaza Health Ministry, which is run by Hamas, said Israel airstrikes killed at least 704 people over the prior day, mostly women and children. Mostly women. Oh, these Jews are brave, aren't they? The Associated Press could not independently verify the death toll cited by Hamas, which says it tallies figures from hospital directors. Israel said Tuesday it launched 400 airstrikes over the prior day. 400 airstrikes in that relatively small area where there are no artillery, aircraft guns, machine guns, tanks. What are you hitting when you make 400 airstrikes in a densely populated area? And it's densely populated because you ran the people from this part of their restricted area down into this part. And there are more of them here. Well, you can kill more of them more easily. 400 airstrikes. A group of Hamas divers that tried to infiltrate Israel on a beach just north of Gaza on Tuesday were confronted by naval forces, the Israeli military said. They got the Navy involved also. Across central and south Gaza, where Israel previously told civilians to take shelter, did you hear what I read? Where Israel told civilians to take shelter, there were scenes of rescuers pulling the dead and wounded out of large piles of rubble from collapsed buildings. Graphic photos and videos shot by the Associated Press showed rescuers unearthing bodies of children from multiple ruins. If they were white children, it would be a different story, wouldn't it? When those two towers were hit by those planes, not nearly that many people were killed, but you saw all the breast beating, the moaning, groaning, and saying the whole world ought to come to their aid. Oh, by the way, they're God's chosen people. It must be a crazy, insane God Buildings that collapsed on residents killed dozens at a time in several cases, witnesses said. 2 families lost 47 members in a leveled home in Rafah, the health ministry said. When Hamas had made that attack on Israel, they didn't do these kind of things. If they had the weaponry, they would have. But if they had the weaponry, they could have held Israel at bay, and Israel wouldn't have been able to steal their land in the first place. A strike on a 4-story building in Khan Yunis killed at least 32 people, including 13 members of the Sakwala family, said Amar al-Bouta, a relative who survived the airstrike. He said there were about 100 people sheltering in the building, including many who evacuated from Gaza City. They came down there and were encouraged by the Jews to come down there, making easy targets. Quote, "We thought that our area would be safe," he said. "They trusted the wrong people." Another strike destroyed a bustling marketplace in the Nusayrat refugee camp in central Gaza. A refugee camp attacked with bombs by God's chosen people. AP photos, Associated Press, showed the floor of a vegetable shop covered in blood. In Gaza City, at least 19 people were killed when another airstrike, attacked a house. They bring in airplanes to attack houses? Then they whimper and whine? It struck the house of the Balul family, according to survivors who said dozens more people remain buried. I know this brought great joy throughout the Jewish state when they were told that they killed the women and the children and buried them all, just blew their houses up with airplanes. And I'm sure there was great joy in the Jewish state. The health ministry said more than 5,700 Palestinians have been killed in the war, including some 2,300 children. Oh yeah, they're good at attacking children also. The fighting killed more than 1,400 people in Israel, mostly civilians slain during the initial Hamas attack, according to the Israeli government. No airplanes, no tanks, no artillery. And that land had belonged to the Palestinians. It was stolen. As the death toll in Gaza spirals and fuel supplies dwindle, the number of facilities able to deal with casualties is shrinking. More than half of primary health care facilities and about 1 of every 3 hospitals have stopped functioning, the World Health Organization said. You know why I'm talking like this? People will be outraged and furious. Words which can be countered by words. But if they were not true, if they were not striking the mark, there'd be no anger, there'd be laughter. If you went into an insane asylum and people were babbling and you were not sympathetic and willing to recognize those people's situation, but stereotyped it, you'd laugh at them. It would be funny. They're behaving like what they are, idiots, morons, and crazy people. The Jewish state is one large insane asylum, and Jerusalem is the violent ward. Overwhelmed hospital staff struggled to triage cases as constant waves of wounded were brought in. The health ministry said many wounded are laid on the ground without even simple medical intervention, and others wait for days for surgeries because there are so many critical cases. While Israel allowed a small number of trucks filled with aid to enter it, it barred deliveries of fuel to Gaza, saying it wants to keep it out of Hamas's hands. Hamas is the excuse for everything they're doing. Hamas doesn't have machine guns. Hamas doesn't have anti-aircraft guns. Hamas doesn't have tanks. Hamas doesn't have any of that. To make room for the dead, cemeteries have been forced to excavate and reuse old plots, families having dug trenches to bury multiple bodies at a time. The Nazis had mass graves for the Jews. They'd line them up along a trench, down on their hands and knees, come behind, put a bullet in the back base of their skull, push them in, and then bulldoze the dirt. And Jews thought that was terrible. But look what they're doing. They learned well from the SS, the Schutzstaffel, didn't they? The Waffen SS. Quote, bodies pour in by the hundreds every day. We use every empty inch in the cemeteries, said Abdul Rahman Mohammed, a volunteer who helps transfer bodies to Khan Yunis main cemetery. Israel claims that it does not target civilians and that Hamas militants are using them as cover for their attacks. Well, who are they targeting when they bomb civilian areas? And they're bombing the civilian areas where they told the people in the other place in northern Gaza, told them to come south, and now that's where they're bombing. And they're surprised that they're killing civilians? If you pour water in one of those canvas skins that they held water, and then you punch a hole in the bottom, should it be a surprise if the water runs out? You know that's what's going to happen. And when you do it intentionally, your intention is that it run out. Does it seem like I'm raving like a madman? I'm mad, not in the sense of insane, but angry or outraged, disgusted, incensed. Even war has developed what is called laws of war. There are certain things which, even in wartime, and the purpose of a war is to kill, certain types of killing cannot occur without violating the laws of war. Doesn't it seem like that's a contradiction in terms, laws of war? But the Jews joined in when the Nazis were put on trial at Nuremberg. They were at war, but they violated the wars. You can use anti-aircraft guns to shoot down airplanes. That doesn't violate the law of war. You can fly with airplanes and bomb troops. That doesn't violate the law of war. But if you turn those things against people who are called non-combatants, who are not in the business of taking your life, then you have committed what is called a war crime. And that seems like a contradiction of terms, in terms. How can there be crimes in war where the ultimate aim is to destroy and kill as many people as you can, as was done when the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki? All done by Christians and Jehovahites. Israel claims that it does not target civilians, even though they know civilians are there. If I can anticipate the outcome of an action, the law says that I intended that action. So, if you are killing civilians and you know the civilians are there, you're targeting them. It can't be called anything else. It says Hamas militants are using them as cover for their attacks. Well, Hamas is not attacking in Israel. It's not a war. Hamas doesn't have any weapons that it can fight Israel with. Can you fight a tank with a pistol, with rocks? Israel has vowed to destroy Hamas. Iranian-backed fighters around the region warn of possible escalation, including the targeting of U.S. forces deployed in the Mideast. If a ground offensive is launched, that is what will happen. Israel and Hezbollah have traded fire almost daily across the Israel-Lebanon border. I can't go through everything that I intended to, but I have something. If I read rapidly, I might be able to finish it before my time is up. Anyway, it dealt with Biden finally warning Israel that if they continue their murderous ways, then America will have to change its policies with reference to Israel. If Israel continues to kill civilians, then the concern that Biden would have addresses the supplying of weaponry to Israel. I'm not going to keep talking about this on this program, but it's one of those situations where as things continue to happen, and I see unarmed people, huge numbers of children. When I say huge, numbering in the thousands, there's no excuse for that. How about all these so-called pro-life people? Oh, that's right, they're concerned only with fetuses, aren't they? Once the fetus becomes a full-fledged human being outside of the womb, then all the concern is gone. They can be hungry, they can be ragged, they can be homeless, and these pro-life people who are so concerned about fetuses will say, well, she shouldn't have had the little bastard if she couldn't take care of him. You see how hypocritical religion is? I don't begrudge people anything they believe. And what difference would it make if I did anyway? I don't control anybody. Maybe if they listen to me and I talk, or if they watch what I do and they don't like it, then to the extent that they allow what I do to impact on them, I own them. But I don't own them in the sense of having physical control and power over them so that I can harm them to pleasure myself or just to have something to do. I'm going to tell you the truth. I knew that people in the so-called Jewish state were vicious and cruel. What they would do in the land that they had forced the Palestinians to be in, they call them occupied areas. They would allow these so-called Jewish settlers to go there, take a Palestinian's home, then bring the army in and protect that settler because now it's his home. And the settler had better not be harmed by the former owner of the house. No, they were talking about the Jews who developed that so-called Jewish state and now showing just how murderous, vicious, and inhumane they are. But remember this, brothers and sisters, what I'm saying applies only to the ones who are doing it, not those who happen to live there but are not doing this. The crime is committed by the perpetrators, not by the ones who happen to be there also. I say again, if you have Jewish friends, don't make them enemies because of what's happening in Israel. Don't turn against anybody because of what somebody like them is doing. Until this person does something that merits that, let your relationship remain what it is to that person. Not all Jews are bad. Not all Zionists are bad. Not all Israelis are bad. But such a large number are, or acquiesce in what's being done that's bad, will cause human beings, being what human beings are, will stereotype and apply the stereotype to any and everybody. And with that, as the canary said when he found out the cage door was open, I'm out of here.
You've been watching The Ernie Chambers Show. If you'd like to leave suggestions, email us at ewcfacts@gmail.com. That's ewcfacts@gmail.com. This is an EWC Communications production.